Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome. Good to have you back. People called and said, "Are you going to have it?" Yeah, absolutely. We're going to have it. We're in good shape. So maybe a few more people will be online instead of here tonight. I want to apologize to anyone who tried to find the video from last week. I don't know why it didn't record. I thought I set it to record, but it didn't record, and so we don't have the video from last week. We do have the some notes and PowerPoints. That's not much, but if somebody wants those, they can ask me for those, and we'll put them on the website then, and people can get that. But oh, good, we've got one in the okay. Uh, so we are recording tonight, so it should be there, and that'll be good. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Lord God, we marvel at your wisdom. You decided to save the whole world, and you started with just one man, one couple, Abram and Sarai. And Lord, you began to work in their lives and in the life of their family and in this world, and you have not stopped. We marvel at your grace, for we see that these people were not worthy of your blessings and your promises, just as we are not worthy of your blessings and promises, and yet you gave them, and you have given us your blessings and promises. We thank you for those given to us through Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Okay, so last week, Genesis 1 through 11, kind of the prehistory, everything from creation all the way up, and it ends with the little genealogy of a guy called Abram. So God is going to set the world right. God has created the world. Adam and Eve wrecked the world. But God says, even as he's judging them, hey, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to put it right. And God's plan to put it all right begins with Abram. So let's look before there are two things I want to do in this class. One is if you know nothing about the Bible, I mean, you don't know which side you start reading from, right? I want you to come away from this with a good understanding of the people and the events and what happened in Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all that. If you're someone who has, a degree in theology and you know a lot about the Bible, I hope that you will still get some things. So I want to look at some of the timeline, some of the archaeology stuff before we get into the actual text and what's going on there. So think about Abraham. When did Abraham live? He lived about 2,000 years before Jesus. Now, 2000 BC was either near the beginning or the end of his life, depending on how we date the Exodus. So by the time you get to King David, you've got a solid timeline established. Before that, there's a little bit of question about just when things happen. And so you have Bible scholars, you have archaeologists, all this. So you see there are two possible dates for the Exodus, one around 1446 BC and the other 1260. Now, people argue based on various things in the Bible, various archaeological things. They say, well, that this layer of destruction at Jericho means it's probably here, or this, and so they'll get, and you start hearing one and the other, and it's hard to know which one is really there. I lean toward this earlier date here, the earlier one. A lot of it hinges on how we read 1 Kings 6:1. So 1 Kings 6:1 says, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the fourth year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month, he began to build the house of the Lord. So Solomon builds the temple. He begins to build the temple, and they date this chronologically. It's 480 years after the Exodus. So you think that gives us a really solid date for the Exodus, and that would be, uh-oh, why is my, oh, and that would be this earlier date here. The only thing about that is 480 is what? 40 times 12. Both are very symbolic numbers in the Bible. So there are those who say it's not a literal 480. When it says 480, you're taking 12 times 40, and they're not being that specific. And so that opens up for some of the discussion about the other things. But if you take that as being an actual 480, then you get that earlier date. And there are a lot of, I'm not going to get into all the details about that stuff. Anyway, Abraham is 2,000 years before Jesus, give or take just a little bit. And the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, fit perfectly into what we know was happening in the ancient Near East at that time. So Walter Kaiser and Paul Winger have written a history of Israel in the Old Testament period. And here's some of the things they share. They say evidence from major tells, these are kind of mounds of debris that have built up over the years where archaeologists dig, in Canaan suggests greatly reduced populations and smaller occupations scattered in the arid outskirts of the land during the period. This allowed foreigners such as Abram much easier access. So what happened was before Abraham's time in the land of Canaan, where he goes, there's a strong urban culture. There are big cities. They're fortified, and foreigners are just not welcome. It would have been very difficult for Abraham to come in. Scholars debate about what happened and whether it was sickness, some kind of plague or something, or war, or just what kind of brought down the culture. But it was brought down, and at the time that Abraham came into the land of Canaan, it was much more possible to do that. There was a lot more openness and opportunity for him to do that. About 2000 BC, things began to radically change in Palestine with a revival of urban life. Gradually at first and then more extensively. Generally, foreigners were not looked on favorably by the local population. But given the fact that so many people were entering the region, Abram could settle there. They say Abram must not be depicted as a nomadic shepherd tending a few straggly sheep and goats. He is perhaps better understood as a merchant prince who trades with monarchs and needs the security force of some 318 men to oversee his capital investments of his means of trade, which are his herds. So Abraham is a herdsman. He has the sheep and the goats and camels and all that stuff. But he's not this little subsistence guy who just goes around eking out a living. He's dealing in livestock and he's going around trading. Let's see. They have so archaeologists have found something they call execration texts in Egypt. And basically, these are texts where they would write on clay and they would write curses on their enemies. And then they would break them to symbolically break their enemies. So they found these. And in the record of the Bible, like Abraham went here, he stopped here, he went here. Well, they found these place names. Towns or cities which the patriarchs allegedly had contact with often turn out to be some of the very cities mentioned in these texts. This is a presumption in favor of the biblical text's early authenticity. So what you have here is all the places the Bible mentions are also mentioned in Egyptian records. And this is not something people made up later on. Now, that doesn't prove that God made a covenant with Abraham, but what it does show is that these stories come from this time period. Okay, so Abraham's family comes from Ur. Ur is in Iraq today. It's mentioned 4 times in the Bible. It's a hometown of Abraham, occupied very early on. Where's my clicker having trouble here? Ah, okay. Excavations of Ur have continued on and off since the 1800s. There's a tomb there with gold and silver objects. A very powerful city before it fell. Yeah, here we go. A village of Haran, so Abraham's father moved them from Ur to Haran, exists in Turkey and has been found to stand atop the ancient one from the Old Testament period. So that town still exists. The cities of Ur and Haran both had the moon god as their main deity. Terah, the father of Abraham, worshipped other gods and moved his family from Ur to Haran in the north. And then, of course, Abram moved from there to Canaan. So also found near Haran are villages that still bear the names of Abraham's great-grandfather and grandfather. Of course, Haran is the father of Lot. So the names and the places fit. Okay, so there's a tomb painting from Egypt dating close to the time of Abraham, and it shows a caravan of people from Cana carrying merchandise. And I'll show you this. They carried eye paint to sell and armed themselves with bows and spears. Uh, it shows how people from the time of Abraham and Sarah looked and how they dressed and their hairstyles. So if you want to see what Abraham and Sarah looked like, how they would have dressed, this picture from Egypt is going to show you. Here we go. So these are you see the Canaanites here, and they've got the spear. This guy's got a lyre, the musical instrument that you play. This guy's got a bow. You see the different dresses and things like that. And these are people coming from the region of Cana down to Egypt to trade, which, we know Abraham did. He went down to Egypt. So you can see the fashions of the day and kind of how they would look. These are the Egyptians here, and then Canaanites up there. So that's kind of cool. So the weapons they used to pick some of the armaments available to Abraham. Then we have the law code of Hammurabi, another thing that kind of speaks to the accuracy of the biblical accounts is the law code of Hammurabi, which comes from a little bit later. It's 1750 BC. Has about 300 laws. And so what's interesting there is that the price of a slave in the narratives in Genesis is the same as in Hammurabi's law code. So somebody had some accurate data there. So that's where Hammurabi's law code was found. And that's a picture of the top of Hammurabi's law code. And then all of the laws are written like that. So if you're able to read that, good for you. And then finally, the Nuzi tablets, excavations of the ancient city of Nuzi, east of the Tigris River, turned up 20,000 baked clay tablets. So they didn't write on paper, they would write on these clay tablets. And many of these tablets reveal customs and stories very similar to those in Genesis, such as the different kinds of marriage, adopting an heir, surrogate motherhood, and inheritance. So like Levirate marriage, where, if a man marries a woman and when he dies with no children, then his brother marries her and the offspring are considered the children of the first brother and that kind of thing. We see some of that going on in Genesis. All those kinds of things that you're like, wow, that's kind of odd. Well, we know that was going on. All that stuff was perfectly normal for them. Other people around are doing it too. So, if there's anything. Yeah, but the culture changed very slowly. So these tablets help explain some of the common practices and background which are found in the biblical events. Okay, so with all that, we see some of the archaeological stuff, some of the historical stuff that tells us, hey, when we are reading about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we are in that time, we are in that world. This is not something somebody made up later on. This is not fiction. They this stuff was like that. It's accurate. Okay, so Abraham, Genesis 12. It's a key text. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house, this was in Haran, to a land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Of course, Paul says that's a promise of Jesus. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. That's his nephew. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abraham journeyed on, still going toward the Negev. So Abram, in response to God's call and promise, leaves his family's new hometown there in Haran, and he goes down into the land of Canaan, what we call Israel today. And he's there kind of in the middle part of the country, and then he heads further toward the south. And God promises someday your descendants will have this land. God promises to make him a great nation, to bless him, and all those sorts of things. So God has shown grace to Abram, who I'm going to go ahead and call Abraham later. God changed his name to Abraham, which means father of many. So I'm going to go just for ease of reference. I'm going to call him that. It hadn't happened in the text yet. So he goes down to Egypt next. There's a famine in the land, and he and his family and people go down to Egypt, and this is not his finest hour. This is the time that Abram goes and he tells Pharaoh that his wife is his sister, right? Oh, that's my sister. And so there's this whole confusion where Pharaoh starts dating her, and then everything goes wrong, and Pharaoh's like, what's going on? And so it's interesting. So here's a guy. He's just somebody, right? I mean, until God appears to him and calls him, he's just anybody else, right? There's nothing special about him. He's just one more person among many. His family, they probably worship the moon god among others. And yet God appears to him and calls him and gives him these promises. So here's God's grace. And you think, all right, well, now God's grace has come to Abraham, and he is going to be a mighty man of God, and he will show the world God's glory, and he will. And the first thing we see is he's down here in Egypt lying and weaseling. And you're like, wait, like what is going on here? But that's what he does. So after this, they go back up to Canaan. Abram and Lot separate because they both have a lot of herds, they both have a lot of livestock, and there's water is scarce, and their shepherds are fighting at the wells, and there's one thing and another. They're like, okay, and so Abram says, look, you know, you pick the land you want and settle there, and I'll go somewhere else. So Abraham starts to do better, and God again says, I am going to give you this land. And then some kings from the north come raiding, and they capture Lot and a bunch of other people, and they take them away captive. And Abraham, and this is where his 318 henchmen come in, they follow in pursuit. Someone comes and tells Abram, and so he saddles up and he gets his posse and he rides out after him, and he defeats these kings, and he rescues these people, and he brings them back. Now, as he's bringing them back, Melchizedek, the king of Salem, which is Jerusalem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of Most High God, and he blessed him, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. Blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." Now, Melchizedek is an interesting figure. He's the king of Jerusalem, and he's a priest. So he comes and he welcomes Abraham, and he gives provisions to his men. And Abraham gives Melchizedek a tenth of the spoils, a tithe of the spoils. Now, this comes up later on in the book of Hebrews, because the author of Hebrews has a bit of a quandary. And his quandary is this: Jesus is a prophet, he's a priest, and he's a king. Right? Jesus, as our great high priest, offers the one great sacrifice. But here's the problem: priests came from the tribe of Levi. Jesus came from the tribe of Judah. So how is Jesus a priest? And the author of Hebrews says, well, He's not a Levitical priest. He's not one of those priests. He's a priest like Melchizedek, the king. That's a picture of Jesus. So Melchizedek is kind of a little hint, a little preview, just a shadow, a type of Jesus. So that if you're reading the Bible for the first time ever and you don't know anything about Jesus, you don't know anything about anything in the Bible, and you read Melchizedek, you're not going to think, oh, well, Jesus is coming. Here it is. But by the time you get to Jesus, then you're like, oh, wait, it's like that guy. So there's a little hint here. There's a little clue about what's coming. So Melchizedek, kind of an interesting and important figure there. So that's Genesis 14 as Melchizedek. Then in Genesis 15, God renews his covenant with Abraham. Genesis 15. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir, your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward the heaven, and number the stars if you are able to number them. And he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Now that's an important verse too. Abraham was counted as righteous because he believed God's promise. Righteous by faith, just like we are, saved by grace through faith in Christ. Paul even says, those who have faith are the children of Abraham. They're the heirs to the promises because they have faith like Abraham. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you the land to possess. But he said, O Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, Bring me a. Now, before I read the. So God speaks to Abram, and he gives him these promises. But here's Abraham's problem. God says, You are going to be a great nation. Abraham's like, Well, before I'm a great nation, don't I have to at least be a father? Before I can have descendants as numerous as the stars, I mean, I'm going to have to start with one, right? And I don't see it. God says, All this land I am going to give to your descendants, to you and your descendants. And Abram's like, Well, I don't own any of it. Before I own the whole land, I mean, don't I need like a small plot, quarter acre, maybe something like it? How do I know that I'm going to get so Abraham gets tested by God, and we see the life of faith is not necessarily easy, right? When God's grace takes hold of us, it doesn't mean we're never going to fail. Obviously, Abraham did, and sometimes we're going to succeed. He did that too, but sometimes, most of the time, a lot of the time, you have to hope for what you don't see. You have to trust God. Faith is the assurance of things that are not seen, as the book of Hebrews says. Abraham has no proof of this. He has God's promise, and that's about it. He has to trust. So he says, How will I know? And God said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, a young pigeon. And he brought him all of these, cut them in half, and laid each half against the other, but he did not cut the birds in half. When the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. Behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. And the Lord said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that will not be theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, you shall be buried in a good old age. They shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, and so on and so forth. So I read this before when we were talking about covenants. God makes a covenant. And in those days, when you made a covenant, you would take a sacrificial animal, cut it in half, and then would walk through the pieces basically to say, okay, if I break our covenant, may this happen to me, right? May what happened to these animals happen to me if I don't keep the terms of the agreement. So God doesn't make Abram pass through. God symbolically, passes through a torch and things like that. And so God basically is giving the promise. He's giving the guarantee. And he says, basically to Abraham, look, I am giving you the promise, and you have to trust me, and you will see that it's true, because I will not break my word. And so he swears this oath, and he makes a covenant with Abraham. And time goes by, and Abram and Sarai do not have any children. And so Sarai, Abram's wife, is thinking, maybe I'm the problem. But she says, you know, how about Hagar, my servant? She could be like a concubine, and you could have a child with her, and then you're going to have this heir. Then you're going to have your own son. And Abram, not being overly bright, goes, good work, I guess. Let's give it a try. And so they do. And she conceives and bears a son, and this is Ishmael. So now Abraham has Ishmael as his son. But Ishmael is not the one who will bear the promise. So this is Genesis 16. They hatched that. Genesis 17, that God makes circumcision the sign of the covenant, and then Isaac's birth is promised. And this is where the famous three travelers come, and Abram prepares them a meal, and they say, we're going to visit you next year. And at this time next year, your wife Sarah is going to have a son. And Sarah's listening at the tent, because the tent is, so she's like out there and they don't know she's there. And she laughs at that. And they're like, why did you laugh? She's like, I didn't laugh. They're like, yes, you did. You laughed. Anyway, so basically, is anything too hard for the Lord? And this is a visitation of God telling Abraham it's going to happen. And it does. Um, you have the whole thing with Sodom and Gomorrah and God rescuing Lot, and then more travels and some problems. And then in chapter 21 of Genesis, Isaac is born. The name Isaac means laughter, because they laughed, but it turned out to be true. And so they named this son Laughter. Well, things quickly go bad because Sarah becomes jealous of Hagar, right? And so here's Ishmael, and he's older, and he and Abram have a good relationship. And here's Isaac, and he's this little tiny guy. And she's like, this is not good. There's competition here. This is not. So she goes to Abram, and she says, send Hagar and Ishmael away. And Abram doesn't want to do it. He's like, it's my son. And she's like, this is not, going to work. You got to send him away. And so Abraham is very distraught. And God says, don't worry. I will take care of them. Isaac is the one who bears the promise. And so Abram sends them away, or Abraham, he's Abraham by name, he sends them away, and God protects Hagar and Ishmael. Ishmael will not be the heir to the promise, but God blesses him nonetheless. So then there's that famous passage in Genesis 22 where God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. So he's been through all this, years of waiting to have a child. Then there's Ishmael. Now we got the problem solved. Well, no, you don't. Okay, now Sarah's going to have a son, and it's Isaac, and Isaac is great, and Abraham loves Isaac, and everything's perfect, and everything's fine. And God says, okay, I want you to sacrifice Isaac. And Abraham's like, wait, what? And so this is the great test, right? Now there are several things going on here. People hear the story and they think this is horrible. Well, there are a couple of things you need to understand. One is how this story functions in ancient Israel, right? Because by the end of the story, Abraham does not sacrifice Isaac. He's willing to, but God stops him and provides a ram caught in a thicket, and Abraham sacrifices the ram instead. Now, how would this help ancient Israelites? All the nations around them, and some of them living like right there with them, practiced child sacrifice. So you have your Canaanites, right? And they're talking to Israelites, and they're like, well, we really worship our gods. You're not as devout as we are. They're like, yes, we are. They're like, no, you're not. You're not as because we sacrifice our children. The Israelites are, well, God doesn't want that. They're like, yeah, right. You just don't. And so, but if Abraham doesn't do it, right? The great father of faith, the friend of God, the original covenant God, if he doesn't sacrifice, then see, you shouldn't either. So the story actually functions in Israel to protect children. There's a lot of pressure. And there were times when they fell into idolatry, they did sacrifice children. The prophets were really bent about that, and God's judgment fell like a hammer. But they weren't supposed to do that, and Abraham is an example of that. He didn't sacrifice children, but it didn't mean he wasn't wholly devoted to God. There's also the aspect of the testing here. So God knows Abraham's heart, but does Abraham know his heart? Not until this happens. So God tells him to go to Mount Moriah, and it's where the temple would eventually be built, not far from where Jesus is sacrificed. And here's another aspect of the story, right? Abraham doesn't sacrifice Isaac. Instead, God provides a sacrifice. You see the connection. It's happening very close to where later on Jesus will be crucified. Right? We are not put to death. God provides a sacrifice. It's a picture of Jesus. It's kind of a photographic negative picture of Jesus, where right here where the temple is going to be, right near where Jesus was crucified, God sends Abraham up and provides a sacrifice, a substitute for Isaac. So that's a really tough story for a lot of people, but there are a lot of good things there that are very important. Not least of which that Abraham is fully devoted to God, and he discovers that. Okay, let's see, where are we? Okay, after that, Sarah dies, and the action turns to Isaac. Now, Sarah told Abraham, I do not want my son marry one of these Canaanite women. They're trashy. I don't know if she said that, but anyway, she didn't like the Canaanites, right? They're uh, pagan idolater, whatever. She's like, no, these are no good. You got to send back to Haran, back to the family, and find a decent girl for our son. So Abram sends a servant, right? And the servant goes back to Haran, and he's like, Lord, you got to help me with this. I'm going to go to the well, and if some woman says, "Hey, I'll water your camels," that's going to be a sign. So he goes, and this woman named Rebecca comes up, and it turns out that she's like a distant relative of Abraham's, like Abraham's brother's daughter. So it's kind of his cousin. Anyway, so the servant says, "Look, here's why I'm here. You guys know Abraham. What do you say, Rebecca? Will you marry Isaac?" And they're like, "Yeah, let's do this." And so she goes back with the servants and the people, and she goes back, and there's this classic line. And if there's one verse in the Bible that I wish I could hear the tone of voice It would be Genesis 24:65. So the servant and all the other people with him and Rebekah, they're headed back toward where Abraham and Isaac are. And okay, starting at 25:63. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening, and he lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, there were camels coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel and said to the servant, "Who is that man walking in the field to meet us?" The servant said, "It is my master." So she took her veil and covered herself. That line, "Who is that man walking in the field to meet us?" I mean, the tone of voice there is everything. It's like, Who, who's that man walking in the field to meet us? It's like, oh, I hope it's not that creepy guy, you know? Or it's like, who's that man walking in the field to meet us? You know, I mean, the tone is just everything there, right? I mean, you wish you knew. It's like, what was she thinking? And it doesn't say. I just wish we knew. It's, ooh, who is that? You know. Anyway, they get married. So Isaac and Rebekah get married. Genesis 25. Abraham dies, and a new generation comes along. There's a birth of twins, Esau and Jacob. Now, there are two key themes that we're seeing in this. One is grace. So these people don't deserve the blessings. I mean, Abraham's record is a real mixed bag, right? Isaac seems a little bit better, but maybe not someone you would super admire. Jacob and Esau, oh my goodness. I mean, Esau, he just, he's a man who lives for his passions and urges and doesn't care about his birthright. And he just, and Jacob, he's this little weasel. I mean, just a weasel. We'll get to his weaseling. And so Esau is born, and then Jacob is grasping his heel. So Jacob, the name Esau means red because he's got the red hair, and Jacob means one who grasps or supplants or cheats. So he's well named, and yet God chooses them, right? He chooses them. God has grace on them. God says, I'm giving my covenant to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And we're like, wait, Jacob? You couldn't find anybody better than Jacob? God's like, Jacob, that's and we're like, Jacob's a jerk. And God's like, I'm not finished with him yet. You just wait, see what I'm going to do to Jacob. I'm going to turn that guy around. The other thing is election. God chooses these people. And they don't choose God. God doesn't, put up a sign that says, "Hey, looking for covenant people, please apply." He chooses them, and he chooses Isaac, but not Ishmael, Jacob, but not Esau. In Romans 9, Paul talks about this. Romans 9, verses 10 through 16. And not only so, but also when Rebekah had conceived children by one man, our forefather Isaac, though they were not yet born and had done nothing, either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls, she was told, "The older will serve the younger." As it is written, "Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated." Now, that's a Semitic expression there, and it doesn't mean, oh, I hate Esau, I can't stand that guy. It means Jacob is the one I've chosen, Esau's the one I have rejected. What shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means, for he says to Moses, "I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." So that it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. Okay, so that's as far as I'll read with that. But so it's God who says, okay, it's going to be Jacob and not Esau. And we wonder at that, but it is God who has mercy. And honestly, neither of them deserved God's promises and blessing, but yet God had mercy where he would. So Genesis 26, God reaffirms the covenant with Isaac. 26, 1 through 5. Now there was a famine in the land, besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. And the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt, dwell in the land in which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands. And I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven, and I will give to your offspring all these lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So God made the covenant with Abraham. He renewed the covenant with Isaac. Now, after this, Jacob steals Esau's birthright. It's a famous story where Isaac is about to die and he says, I want to bless my son. Well, first there's the day when Esau comes in from the field. He's really tired. Jacob's cooking. He says, hey, give me some of that. And Jacob says, well, I'll trade you a bowl of porridge for your rights as the firstborn. And Esau, either not caring or not taking him seriously, agrees and despises his birthright. Later on, Isaac is dying, and he says, I want to bless my son Esau. Now, here was a problem. This family had problems, right? I mean, they're messed up people, right? Like us. And so Isaac, he had a favorite, and that was Esau. And Rebekah, she had a favorite, and that was Jacob. So you just know their house was harmonious. So Abraham tells Esau, hey, I want you to go out. I'm about to die. I'm going to give you your blessing. Right? I'm going to bless you up really good, but go and hunt something and make some stew and bring it in, and we'll eat together, and I'll give you a blessing. He's like, okay. So he goes out to hunt. Rebekah hears this. She goes to Jacob. She's like, quick, we're going to trick your dad. His eyesight's not good. Jacob's like, well, how are we going to trick? She's like, okay, well, get these skins, put them on your arm. He's like, Esau's hairy. I'm not hairy. She's like, we'll use some goat skins. Okay, now I'm going to whip up some stew. I'm going to do this. So Jacob comes in, and Isaac's like, how did you do that so quickly? He's like, well, the Lord blessed the hunt, and he's like, you sound like Jacob. He's like, yeah, but feel my hairy arms. And so he tricks his father, and Isaac just gives him the blessing, this massive blessing. And then he goes out, and then Esau comes in, and Isaac's like, wait, who are you? He's like, I'm Esau. He's like, but you were just, oh no. And he's like, wait, bless me too. And there's not much of, but he gives him what blessing he can. And this puts enmity even more than before between the brothers. And at this point, Jacob is really worried that Esau is going to kill him. And so he hightails it back to his mother's family in Haran, right? And he goes to his uncle Laban, who is his mother's brother. And you remember what happens on the way. Jacob wrestles with God. There's a no, that comes later. Okay, so on the way he has a vision uh, as he's going. It's in Genesis 28, his dream. Genesis 28:10. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran, and he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. He was using a rock for a pillow? Who does that? And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up to earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and the east, and the north and the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to the land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. So God gives a covenant to Abraham. He renews it with Isaac. He renews it with Jacob. He says, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to bring you back to this land. I'm going to make you a great nation. That same promise, in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That hidden promise of the gospel that we don't see till the New Testament. Paul says that's a promise of Jesus. He gives that to Jacob. And Jacob goes to Laban and his uncle, and his uncle's happy to welcome him. And then Jacob's helping out, and Laban says, why should you work for me for nothing? What do you want for wages? And Jacob says, well, funny you should ask. I noticed your daughter Rachel, and so anyway, he's in love with Rachel, and he says, look, I'll work for you for 7 years, and I'll marry Rachel, and that's the agreement they come up with. You remember what happened, don't you? I mean, if you know the Bible, this is one of the big stories. So Jacob's wedding night comes along, and Laban probably gives him a little too much to drink, and they have the wedding, and Jacob wakes up the next morning, and it's her sister Leah. And he goes to complain to Laban, and Laban's like, wow, we can't marry the younger daughter before the older one. Everybody knows that. And Jacob's like, yeah, but you ripped me off. So Jacob, right, the guy who's ripping everybody off, he gets a taste of his own medicine, and he doesn't like it. So he says, Laban says, okay, I tell you what, you work for me another 7 years, you can go ahead and marry Rachel now. So he agrees to it. Now we have a problem because Jacob has how many wives? Two. Okay. Oh, that's the Romans passage. Um, okay, it'll come down in just a minute. He has two. There we go. And so he loves Rachel. He doesn't love Leah, but Leah's the one who's having all these sons, right? And so then they get into like this baby war. And so Rachel says, okay, my servant, she could be like your concubine, and maybe, you can have kids that way. We've seen that before. And so they do that. And then Leah's like, whoa, hold on. I've got one. I've got a servant too, so then, they do that. And Jacob, I mean, you can imagine how miserable this guy's life was because he's married to two women, they're sisters, and they hate each other. And that must have been just a recipe for real domestic bliss. So eventually, though, Rachel does have two children, first Joseph and then Benjamin. So, by the way, people sometimes say, oh, marriage, the Bible has all kinds of, the Bible, there's not one kind of marriage in the Bible, no, in Genesis, Adam and Eve, and Jesus says this is God's design for marriage, one man, one woman. The Bible reports that people did different things, but it doesn't say that's a good idea. In fact, every time in the Bible a man marries more than one woman, disaster ensues. And it happens here. So Jacob ends up with 12 sons, and there's only 10 up there. Well, that's interesting. There's some guys missing. Oh, and Gad is on there twice. Okay, well, ignore this then. Wow, who made that? That's terrible. So yeah, I forgot. That was from my okay. I think I see the front. So anyway, he has 12 sons. And just as Isaac and Rebecca had their favorites, right? Jacob has favorites. Who are his favorites? His favorites are Joseph and Benjamin because it's Rachel's sons. And so he favors them. He gives Joseph the famous coat of many colors, right? And this causes his brothers to resent him. Now, for his part, Joseph is a bit of a jerk, right? And so he will say, oh, I had this dream, right? And the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. They're like, you think we don't know what that means? Anyway, so before all this plays out, uh, Jacob kind of wears out his welcome with Laban. Jacob becomes rich, and Laban feels like it's at his expense. And so Jacob takes off, and as he's heading back to the land of Canaan, there's this night before he encounters his brother Esau, where he wrestles with God. This is Genesis 32, verses 22 through 32. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children. Benjamin hadn't been born yet, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. And he took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket. And Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with the man. Then he said, "Let me go, for day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." So the name Israel means wrestles with God. Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." So there's this famous text where Jacob is wrestling with God, and God blesses him and changes his name to Israel. And then he recrosses he crosses the river there. He meets up with Esau. Everything is okay. He settles in the land of Canaan. The brothers have this falling out. They don't like poor Joseph, and he sends Joseph to check up on his brothers one day, and they're like, "Joseph, let's get this guy." And they throw him down in a cistern, a dry cistern. And there's this whole thing about what are they going to do with him, and some want to kill him, and some want to rescue him. And they end up selling him to Midianite traders, and he's taken down to Egypt. Now, in Egypt, Joseph is sold into the house of Potiphar, and he is a great servant to Potiphar. God blesses Joseph. Everything Joseph touches turns to gold. God is with him, and Potiphar really likes him. But then Potiphar's wife makes a pass at Joseph, and Joseph says no, and she falsely accuses him, and he's thrown in jail. Now he's rotting in jail. Now, I want you to think about Joseph, right? So first, he has this bad home life. His brothers sell him into slavery. They tell his father he's been killed. He ends up as a slave. Then he's falsely accused. Then he's put into prison. This guy's assessing his life. He must think either God doesn't exist or he hates me, right? I mean, you would think all this bad stuff. But God is working out a plan. Let it be a lesson to us all, right? In the midst of hard times and bad things happening, you think God has turned against me. No, God is doing something. You just don't know what it is. So he's in prison, and he becomes a trustee, and pretty soon he starts running the place, and everything he touches turns to gold, and it's great. Well, then there's these 2 servants of Pharaoh who have dreams. Joseph interprets them, and it was the cupbearer is going to be restored, and then he's supposed to tell Pharaoh and get Joseph sprung from prison, and he forgets until Pharaoh has a dream. And then he remembers, and he says, "Hey, there's this guy I know in prison." He's like, "You know a guy from prison? How do you know a guy from prison?" Anyway, so Joseph goes and he interprets Pharaoh's dream. And it's a sign God had given that there's going to be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. So Joseph is obviously hooked up with some divine powers, and Pharaoh says, "Okay, you're the guy to set this right. I'm going to put you over the storehouses. We're going to, what should we do?" Joseph says, "Gather up, plenty of food during the years of plenty, and then you'll have it during the years of famine." Pharaoh says, "Okay, you do it. You're in charge." And so Joseph is now moving his way up. Everything he touches turns to gold, and now he's like second in command in Egypt. And they all lived happily ever after. No, they didn't. Because there was a famine in Canaan, and the brothers come down to buy grain. Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize him because, he's all Egyptianified, different hairstyle, clothing, all this stuff. So he sends them back, and then they're afraid to come back because he put their money back in their pouches. And he said, "Do do you have any other brothers? And you got to bring your brother with you. And so eventually they bring Benjamin, and he sets up Benjamin as if he's stolen something. And so Judah's like, no, 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 it'll kill my dad. He's already lost one son. Keep me instead. Now, this too is a picture of Jesus, right? Because Jesus is from the tribe of Judah, and Judah is like, punish me instead. See? So it's a connection. So eventually they bring, you know, they bring Benjamin down. He tells him, I'm Joseph. They freak out. Ah, we're doomed. And he's like, no. And this is Genesis 50, chapter 50, verse 20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So his brothers did something evil against him, but God was in it working for good. Brought Joseph to Egypt, exalted him, put him in a position that when his family was in need, they could come to Egypt. And so what happens is the family comes down, his father is reunited with him, everybody comes down, they settle in the land of Egypt, and they all live happily ever after. No, they don't, but that's next week's story. So that the last word, does anybody know? Don't look. The last word in the book of Genesis. It's the same in English as it is in Hebrew. Egypt. Right? So Joseph died being 110 years old. They embalmed him and put him in a coffin in Egypt. So the story of the patriarchs ends with Joseph dying and being embalmed in Egypt. The family is now in Egypt. We've gone from creation to fall to Abraham, to God's covenant with Abraham, to this crazy family that does all this wild stuff where they have favorite children and they argue and they fight, and there's just all kinds of craziness, but God loves them and he gives them his promises, and he brings them through, and he settles them in Egypt. And this is where Genesis ends and Exodus begins. But Exodus is next week, and I have a session meeting in like 3 minutes, so I'm going to have to get to that. All right, so thank you for being here this evening, and I hope that was a good kind of overview of the patriarchs and what happens and how God goes from Abraham all the way to getting now they're a family, almost a people in Egypt, and we've seen little glimpses of Jesus all along the way. So we'll pick it up there next week.